Peace, y'all. It's I, the Emma, and this is Decoding the Matrix, number 8, part 2. If you didn't catch part 1 earlier today, then make sure you go back and check that out. If you haven't watched the first 7, you will probably be completely lost. Make sure that you subscribe on YouTube, Energy Masta, like the page so you can get updates and whatnot. We decoding this matrix in a way that you've never had before, because I have cracked many of the codes of the waveform of reality itself. Certain codes that are embedded in the numbers and constants and things that make up our entire framework of the sciences and beyond that. And so I'm going to go ahead, jump right on the whiteboard since we didn't get to that earlier. Let me go ahead and hit that flipperoo on you. Okie dokie. Okay, so if you remember, if you've been keeping up, we had what I call my Phi tables, my golden Phi tablets, Phi tables, whatever we're going to call them. But basically, we had these 3 tables that were 12 by 12 grid, so that gives you your 144. You know your significance of 144 when it comes to spirituality. We established that 144 times 3 is 432. 432 hertz happens to be the frequency that the Great Pyramid of Giza resonates at, so there's a significance to that in the spiritual conversation and whatnot. Okay, and so 3 tablets can be viewed. So if I got 3 squares and I put them corner to corner, I can make one side of a cube. So one, if I have one corner pointing straight at me, I can show one half of a cube. Now, this is where I guess you can get in a conversation of simulation and an illusion. Whereas if I position those 3 squares in the correct way, you assume that you're looking at a full cube, even if there isn't a backside. So normally we would expect there to be 3 other sides on the reverse side that we just can't see right now because we're looking at, this particular face of the cube. Well, imagine that even if it were a full cube, the side that you're not looking at, if nobody's looking at it, it's basically a waveform at that time. Like, you have no way to prove, like, if you're not interacting with that other side, there's no possible way for you to prove that that side even exists as a physical thing without turning the cube, touching the cube, doing something to confirm that. And so there's no way for you to know whether it's always like that. We can make that assumption, but the fact of the matter is you cannot know for sure that your interaction with the opposite side of that cube isn't what's causing it to form and be a solid backside of that cube. It would seem like a far more efficient way for reality to work, to where if certain things are not being directly observed by a certain level of conscious observation, it would be easier for those things not to try to hold an organized type of form. Like it'd just be easier for that energy to be available universally until it's needed for that specific thing. So if we were talking design wise and nature taking the shortest path or the easiest path with things, like I would definitely consider that to be a possibility. So that's just something to kind of open up your mind on. Now let's get into some numbers about so what exactly are these things? So we got these 3 tablets. I've talked about certain properties of them. These 12 by 12s. And let's look at some of these numbers. So essentially, what I have, we talked about how you had these certain lines so that were based on the square. So 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared, and then 6 squared would be the last one. Because if it's 12 by 12, that means we have 3 tablets with 12 rows each. That's a total of 36 rows. Okay. And so the highest square we can get out of 6 rows is 6, because 6 squared is 36. Okay. So since we last talked, I learned a little bit more about the concept of reaction diffusion. So, and I think we talked a little bit about how with light, you have this thing called the law of inverse squares. It basically explains the rate at which light coming out from a source dims as it gets further away from the source. So in other words, it is 1 over the square. So it'll be 1 over 1 squared, 1 over 2 squared, 1 over 3 squared. But basically it's getting smaller and smaller, the intensity of the luminosity of the light as it moves away from the source. Now, with a reaction diffusion, it's the opposite. If I introduce a chemical into a medium so that it can spread out. So let's say like I'm putting a drug into your blood, or I'm dropping some paint inside of some water, just something that is densely packed, and then it dissolves and spreads out. It does this thing called reaction diffusion, which basically has a rate that is the positive diffusion. So we can look at moving by squares as a diffusion, something we talked about entropy in the last video. So we have something that is all together, something that is orderly and organized, and then we drop it into the medium, and then it spreads out, and it gets more and more chaotic as it spreads out. That rate is going to go by squares. So if light is dissipating at an inverse square, and this chemical is spreading out by squares, we could say that's an inverse relationship. And we've already talked a little bit about how the golden ratio and its inverse have a pretty interesting relationship, because when the resistance level in a substance is at the golden ratio, like I say, we got a charge going through, an electric charge going through it. When the resistance is at the golden ratio, the voltage or pressure for that electricity is at the inverse of the golden ratio. So that's a interesting dynamic. And if you know anything about the golden ratio, you know that basically the square root of the golden ratio is the inverse of the golden ratio. If I'm not missing it, hold on, let me think about it. That might not be right. I can't remember. Hold on, because I know. All right, so the golden ratio squared is 1 plus the golden ratio. So yeah, I do think it is square root of golden ratio. Might be something like that. If not, then we'll correct that. Scratch. But then at the very least, we know that its own inverse, if I do 1 divided by the golden ratio, it's the same as subtracting 1 from the golden ratio. So there's 1 distance between the golden ratio and its inverse, which is interesting given the properties of the number 1 itself. All right, so moving right along. So we got these 6 lines. If I think about those 3 tablets, I'm sending sound through it, and let's say that sound is propagating and behaving sort of like how that chemical does, because essentially your body has electrical signals moving through it. It can be thought of as light, and then they're converting into this chemical energy, and this chemical energy is closely related to mechanical energy because it is happening within a solid or whatever, like an actual medium, you know. And so we're going to look at chemical waves as being somewhat similar to sound waves. Just the concept is a non-light wave. Okay. And as such, if we think of that dispersal throughout the 5 tables, that will give us lines 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, and 36. 1, of course, being 1 squared, 4 being 2 squared, 9 being 3 squared, so on and so forth. All right, so in all, we have 6 lines of 12 digits each, which gives us 72 digits. If we look at those digits as degrees, just separate things, so things that are separate. If we look at them as degrees, if this was distributed in 5 directions simultaneously, we could say that's 360 degrees. So, in other words, this same wave that's going from line 1 to line 36, going through these 72 degrees, if I sent that same wave in 5 different directions, like as in your body, so let's say like we're counting from the center of your mass, let's say it's at the heart, for instance, and that pulse of your heart is getting sent in 5 different directions. That'll be arm, leg, arm, head. That will give us 360 degrees. So that's a circle. Remember, circles, we say the edge is technically infinite because there's an infinite number of points along a curve. Okay? So that's you in wave form. Now, what's happening in actual physicality? Now, once again, 360 degrees is also the measurement of a square. Square has four corners. You got north, east, west, and south. 4 is representative of the seasons. It's also representative of the elements, so fire, water, air, and earth. Okay? And so it would appear that we're talking about something having to do with matter. So if we have something intangible with this mode right here, and I need to put I keep getting spam text. I need to put my phone on do not disturb. Okay, got it. All right, but anyway, I don't want that. Go away. All right, so if we look at the inside state, never mind it. If we're looking at it, this wave propagating through the body, going to the 5 limbs as wave, particle form would be the actual physicality. And then when we talk about 4s, we could talk about a couple things, like for instance with DNA, you have 4 nucleotides. You got your A, G, C, and T. That's let me see if I remember: adenine, guanine, tyrosine, and cytosine. Okay, I know a little bit of something. All right, and so just keep that in mind. All right, so anyways, let's look at some other. So we looked at this thing. So 72 degrees. Now, corresponding to that was that 432 hertz for that total table. Now let's look at that. So that in 5 directions gives us 2,160 degrees. And you see that 21 corresponds to U, 6 corresponds to the F, and then 0 is a O. So it just spells UFO. That doesn't mean that it has to do with any actual UFOs or anything necessarily, but it's possible that sometimes that you hear references to UFO, and this is probably part of the reason why the name was changed. But it's possible that they're talking about a cube, and then it's interesting that there were also cube-shaped UFOs in some of those reports. So take it with a grain of salt. So anyway, a cube has 2,160 degrees. All right, so that's the significance here. how these three flat planes can come together to give us the illusion of a full cube, whether or not it has a backside or not. Okay. So 2160 also happens to be the number of miles in the diameter of the moon. So that's interesting. So the same, so we got this certain number of degrees. Let's think about UFO, unidentified flying object. Then we have the moon. We know all the stories about the moon, so on and so forth. Once again, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it's just interesting how these numbers line up, especially given the stories. And if you really think about it right there, the diameter of something is a 2D line. It's a one-dimensional line. Whereas we have that number being applied in a way that gives us a three-dimensional object. So we've got certain things we have to do in order to be able to scale something up through the dimensions such that it's a one-dimensional line in one case, but then we have that same number. If you think of the number itself as an arrangement of magnitudes of a wave within a manifold, which is to say a multi-dimensional plane, if you will, like if I had a piece of paper and I folded it, and each layer of fold represented a different dimension. That's basically what you would be doing. And so you can look at it as numbers behave one way on one dimension, and then they behave a different way on a different dimension. So here 2160 is being applied to degrees as it relates to a three-dimensional cube, but with regards to something like the moon, it's related to its diameter. And so there's a translation of some sort happening, where if I don't know what the moon is, then it is certainly a unidentified flying object. It's just flying. Takes a month, but it's flying all the way around the earth and stuff. So, but with regards to consciousness and translation between dimensions, this gives you an idea of how that same essential number can appear in different ways. What else does that kind of point us towards this cube? So the pole of Saturn has an unusual hexagonal field at its pole, and they know this because there's a storm that's always at the pole and it's shaped like this hexagon. Well, if you didn't notice, in two dimensions, a cube looks like a hexagon with three lines inside of it. So that's enough. So we got a one-dimensional translation in the diameter of the moon. We've got a two-dimensional translation more or less with Saturn's pole, and then you got this three-dimensional translation associated with cubes. So if you know anything about Masonic symbols and all kind of stuff that they have on Earth, even in corporate symbols and stuff like this, they talk about this concept of the black cube. It extends to the Kaaba in Mecca, which I also have written over here. But it's typically associated with certain Saturnian types of worship and all sorts of stuff like this. But it's a symbol that pops up with respect to Saturn. Now remember, this is a golden ratio table. Saturn happens to be a planet where its rings have a Fibonacci or golden ratio relationship with the planet itself. So this is one of those key type of figures where we know there's a relationship associated with it. Now, something you might not realize, so we typically think of a cube having 6 faces, right? So we would do 6 times 1. So each face is worth 1. So 6 times 1. Now, we're talking about this 4-sided square here. So how can we apply this number 4 to here? Well, You could also, another way to get 6 faces would be 4 times 1.5. So if you look at it as me having, okay, I have 1.5 faces. If I have a sheet that's the length of 1.5 of these faces, I could fold those in such a way to where the 4 of those would make a cube. Why is that important? Because a golden rectangle is 1 unit high and it's 1.5 units long. So that such that you can make a square, like you could cut out a square, and then the piece that's left would be exactly half that square. So when you're drawing your Fibonacci spiral and you're using that golden rectangle, that's the proportions that you have to it. You have that proportion of that 1 and then that half. So it's 1 high and 1.5 wide. It translates to 3/2. So if I had one on top of the other, that'll be a height of 2 and then a 3 width, which is another approximation of the golden ratio. Okay, and so start to kind of see some translation from 1 dimension to 2 dimension to 3 dimension there. Okay, so some other places where this cube shows up. So ferric sulfide, so that's iron and sulfur. So in addition to ferric oxide compounds, which are magnetic, you also have ferric sulfide compounds that appear in magnetotactic bacteria. So bacteria that have these little structures, little pyramid-like structures, or whatever shape, they can also have a cubic structure. And these allow them to move and be attracted by magnetic fields. So that has its benefits in certain ways. I talked about the Kaaba, the big cube-like structure that is in Mecca. That's important in Mohammedan Islam. Okay. Chromatin. So the chromatin, the tightly packed DNA structures that are at the center of every single one of your cells, they also take on a cubic shape. And with proteins, like, shape is everything in the body, and depending on which way a protein is folded, that determines its function. So you can look at that as being a primary understanding of what shape is in general throughout all this conversation. So there's a different type of situation happening when I have a square versus a cube, because they're different shapes. If you look at each one of these sides as being a square, just being seen at an angle. So remember what we were talking about in the previous video about the difference between ideal geometry versus linear geometry, or hyperbolic geometry versus linear geometry. In one case, you're going to look at the lines as terminating when they intersect each other, and they both point to 0. So 2 lines are pointing toward a 0-degree point. So they're pointing to a 0. In hyperbolic geometry, if I had curves on this, I would be looking at that as the lines, these curves, are pointing, when they come together, they are pointing toward infinity, because it's an infinite number of points on a curve, because you can keep on breaking it down as not terminating, never terminating. All right, so if we just think of it that way. Okay, so histones. So in our genetic material, our bodies, we have these things that kind of like so DNA has what looks like strings with little beads on them, and these histones, which are you're mostly dealing with 4, but there's technically 5 of them, but for the most part it's these 4. And interestingly enough, this chromatin, when it makes this cube shape, when they fold into these cube shapes, it basically has 2 pairs of these sets of 4. So a total of 8 histones in a specific position. So you got one of those squares in one position and then one opposite in a different position. So in other words, there's a correlation between the positioning of the first that is reciprocated in a sense by the one reflecting it. So when it comes to quantum entanglement in particular, when two particles are entangled, if I turn one of them in one direction, the other one is going to turn in the opposite direction by the exact same amount. So for that reason, the reason that we're able to perceive that this cube, when we can only see 3 of its faces, we can assume that there's 3 on the other side, is because there's a type of entanglement happening, at least with our perception. And so we could predict what the other 3 faces are going to look like and what positions they're going to be in based on where this one is. So likewise, you have something like that. Like maybe you can only see half of the histones, but then if they're kind of reflections of each other, those 2 sets, then you can look at one set and then know a little something about the other set. Now, in my examination, based on the descriptions of the different histones, they correspond very well to this concept of the 4, where each one of those can be linked to the esoteric meaning of the 4 classical elements. So that fire, water, earth, and air. And I kind of talked a little bit about the way those correspond to the 4 nucleotides. I think I did that in one of my older videos. But whenever you're seeing this 4, oftentimes you can make some connection to the esoteric meanings of them. And remember, fire has to do with your will, and in physics, like torque, plasma, things of that nature. Pressures, and the water has to do with the animating principle. So the thing that has to be applied to something in order for it to want to move, and then that is essentially force. But then we want force from within. So what force is being exerted from within something? Just what gives it life at the end of the day. So life involves growth. There's a couple different factors in there, but water, we want to look at animating principle. Okay, soul, if you will. Air would be your intellect. So it's the connection between your spiritual self and your physical self, and it is, you could think of it as a sort of system, a reactionary system, whereas one side does something, there is an equal opposite reaction in the other, so to speak. So the 2 sides kind of depend on each other and are affected by each other by virtue of the intellect of the shared system that they are in, and that is basically air. Because, like, for instance, the movement of the atmosphere and whatever's going on in the atmosphere and the charges that between it and the ground are basically determining the way that wind blows through the in-between. So in between the clouds and the ground, air is whipping because of their interaction with each other. And then, of course, earth is not just the structure of these things, but the nature of those things, because the structure is just a projection of the inherent nature of a thing. Okay, so the design, the template, okay, their blueprint. All right, so all that. And then the 4, what kind of signs would you call them? Like the 4 signs, main signs in math, your plus, minus, multiplication, division signs, they also have a correspondence to those 4. So you can look at each one of those being a specific type of command, a way that elements relate to each other. So we have multiple things. So Remember, the whole idea is you've got a perception of reality where everything is connected, and then you have a perception of reality where everything is separated. And so if our senses are designed to perceive everything as separated, it is those signs like plus, minus, or whatever else that help us to establish relationships between these otherwise separate looking things. And the same applies for numbers. So numbers, when we're talking about quantum, you're talking about a separation between the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. And so these are given a relationship between those. Okay. Now we have another process that is either additive or subtractive or intensifies or lessens something, and we call that speech. So when we describe things, we are drawing relationships between words, and we are sometimes we embellish the story, sometimes we break the story down and examine it, but essentially that is what you're doing with speech, is that you have things that have a particular magnitude relative to each other, and you're inserting signs, signals, symbols that draw relationships between those things. So it's basically a related, if not the same process. Okay, so let's go through each one of these 6 lines. We talked in depth about line 16 and its relationship with Enki or Ankel, and we'll review that in a minute. But let's look at this first line, because the first line is interesting. So if you look at, I meant to go back and look to see how these corresponded to the 6 sub races and root races of like Atlantis and basically the human race, according to Theosophy. Because like going back and actually looking at it in detail, it actually lines up pretty well. I can see how certain aspects of it have been taken and twisted for racist reasons by certain groups, but the way that is originally presented, it doesn't. That ain't what they getting at. Everybody's accounted for, and they more or less fair, depending on who you read, and they're more or less fair as it relates to everybody, whether it hurts or not. It's relatively fair. So anyway, so let's get into it. So we got this first line. So remember, we got these numbers by taking those 12 by 12 grids, starting in the right hand corner and meandering up and down. So I would do the first 12 going straight down, then the next 12 going bottom to top, and then top to bottom, bottom to top until it's full. And then reading the lines from left to right. So this is it's combining a couple of the ways that people wrote and read and encoded messages. Because remember, this meandering approach, which is called Bastraphodon, is how the 72 names of God are derived from Psalms. 72. And then remember, each one of these names is 3 letters long. So we got our 3 tables, and we've got our 72 names, but it's actually 144 because for each one of those names there is a inverse, a demon associated with it. So you can look at one name as being an angel, and then it has another name associated with it that is the challenge or the demon that angel deals with. So that's where you get your 144. And then once again, if I got 144 names with 3 letters each, it gives me 432. So these frequencies, these Hertz frequencies, are somehow related to names, particularly as it relates to positive and negative aspects of what we call God in some traditions. All right, so anyways, so the first line of all of them can be thought of as the original organizing principle And it gives us the number 825-1926-50681. So 8 and 25 are H and Y. So so in the supreme alphabet, that would be he and Y. And we already established that he Y is Yahweh backwards. We did that in another video. So it's interesting that the first thing on here is this he Y, which is not just Yahweh, but Yahweh backwards, and then he Y, and then you could take that all the way to he was. But basically, that is the name of, that's basically where we get their use and all of that stuff. But it basically means the God of breath. And you know how the Genesis story was shaped to have God giving breath to Adam and so on and so forth. But it appears here in the beginning of the line because what we're looking at is a code from which all those various versions of the story is derived. So in other words, the same code was acting in each of these different cultures, and they made their interpretation of it, how they made it, but it's all tying back to the same concept that is woven into the fabric of the reality itself. Okay, now alternatively, the word hi, I believe it's either he or hi, I forget, because I didn't write which language it was from. But in whatever language I was looking at, it meant cry of joy. Okay, so cry, so the calling, so we're thinking sound, joy. That has some inferences because I believe it's the 89 divided by 55 Fibonacci paired. The approximation of the golden ratio that you get from that, it actually, the numbers in it actually spell Afra, so that'll be 161818. And Afra is a name that means, among other things, joy. So the cry of joy, the sound of the golden ratio, which is even more interesting because the way that the now I don't want to say disclaimer, but all right. So as far as Wusabat and the Nuwabians go, so there's certain ways that they break down their words, and one of the claims that's made based on the teachings of Dr. York is that so Yahweh is supposed to be pronounced Huhi according to them, and it has something to do with us, and it's not terribly wrong actually. So it's so the sound Hu, and you would spell that HW in Egyptian. But who, and then it corresponds to the concept of Wu in China. So we got that Wu Tang, so the primordial sound, the primordial vibration, and it corresponds to Om. So over there, so Hu is actually a god in one of these pantheons that is associated with the primordial sound Om. So Hu is the equivalent of that. So we've got the sound of the golden ratio, and we've got Om, the primary. So in other words, and I've actually experienced it this way, it was seen that this sound vibrates the body because our body is based largely on approximations of the golden ratio. So different approximations distributed throughout the body. So as a result, when you're making that sound, you're essentially sending the sound equivalent of that golden ratio relationship through the body, because that is the reality that we are living in. That is the fabric of that reality. So we get this connection between humans, or woman. Woman. So we start getting some of that in there, huh? But anyway, so we get that human, woman associated with this sound. All right, so let's keep going. So AI, that word can mean speech or to say. So we got this Hiwa, the god of breath, that's related to Vayu, the god of wind, and prana in Hindu pantheon. Okay, so life force, if you will. So still maintaining the same thing. And so we can interpret it AI speaks. So we got the sound or the god of speech. He speaks. Okay. Alternatively, also between that, we have BES. So that 1-9 could be a S. So Bes happens to be another Egyptian god. He's a cat god who's a dwarf, and he deals with fertility and childbirth. He protects women and children as birth is happening. Okay, and we'll come back to him in a second because he has something to do with what I'm about to say next. Okay, so next word that we can derive from this. So there's a couple of little things that you can, like I could even go Ib, which actually means oval or temple, among other things. And you got feo in there, in Spanish, feo is ugly, and then so he a little dwarf cat man. You might have thought he was ugly, but that's not what we talked about here. Even more importantly, we got this Zeo. So if you like Power Rangers back in the day, Zeo, but that's not what we getting at here. It's not. We're not saying that Bess is a Power Ranger. Zeo, interestingly enough, turns out that it is the plural for a Zeus fish. So Zeus. So it is interesting. YHWH and Zeus, two words that come from the same root, and it's so being associated with Deus, the word for God, appear here. So it starts to give you some idea of these relationships. How did this culture get this one particular story? So we got the Greek story over here. We've got an Egyptian story right here. We've got the Hindu version of the story. We got the Chinese representative. Like, it's basically touching everybody's stuff right there. And Zeus fish. So multiple ones of this fish. The significance here, and then that fish that's actually a type of dory. So if you like that movie Finding Dory, Dory is a dory fish. And these Zeus are a type of dory fish that happens to be from the Mediterranean. So Egypt, it has there's a city of Egypt that is found on the coast of the Mediterranean. You got Greece on the Mediterranean. Okay, and so for these things to be back to back, that's very fascinating. All right, and then the last part of this line. Oh, so I forgot so the other, before I get to that last part, the significance of that being Zeus and it being fish. So first, a fish in the old esoteric traditions of Africa means an initiate. So it says that whatever we're looking at, it's an initiate associated with this life force, this sound going through the body, this protector of fertility. Okay. Womb man, remember? So that means we're probably sending sound down to the part of the body where the womb would be, which would be the sacral chakra. So just keep that in mind. Now, significance between Bes and Zeus is this figure, King Zeus, who is part of the Sumerian pantheon and appears in Robert Morningsky's The Terror Papers, where he's the namesake of Zeus, and he is a nephew of the god Anu, who was originally, he got the role of being able to rule our solar system. So whenever you hear the word kingdom, they're referring to a whole solar system. And so he was originally stationed on Tiamat, and he actually ran a pretty good operation there. They set up shop on one of the moons on Tiamat, and that is where I believe it was either there that was Olympus, or it was one of the moons of Mars, but I believe it was the moon of Tiamat that was actually Olympus, and there's a different word for it. It basically becomes Olympus in the story. And There were beings that already lived down on the planet itself and in the waters and stuff like this before they even brought their behinds there. But he ran a pretty good operation. Anu was mad jealous of his nephew, and they went into a war, and it was bad. They were flying around Death Stars and shooting at each other, and part there was all kind of destruction, like Uranus. That's why that planet's tilted with this ring. So it got sideswiped, and then Tiamat got mostly destroyed. They used pieces from Tiamat to reconstruct and then made our current Earth. Like, it's all kind of interesting stuff in that story. But the significance is King Zeus, naturally, because he was the enemy of Anu and his family. Well, they had a habit of demonizing anybody that was the ops. So if they didn't like you or you lost the war to them, if the stories and the history that was handed down, they usually tried to shit on your name as much as possible. So Zeus became associated with Pazuzu, so you know the Sumerian demon Pazuzu, and Pazuzu was also supposed to be the equivalent. He's based on Bes, the Egyptian god. Now, one of the other things that's interesting about Bes is that, so you hear the stories about the Queen of Sheba, right? And so Sheba is corresponds to Saba, so you had the Sabaeans. And arguably, in my opinion, these are the same as the Sabines. The Nuwabians connect them to the Nabateans, but linguistically and a few factors in the different stories would lead me to definitely believe, because you had the stories where they would tell it as the Queen of Sheba being raped by Solomon. And incidentally, the Sabines, the women of the Sabines, were also raped by the Romans in that particular story. So it's like, so there's a lot of parallels there that point to it being an original story that was kind of taken and adapted by the later culture. All right. And so, anyways, the significance of it is one of the other ways that Sheba is written and pronounced is Shabes. So it's Shah, S-H-A, which basically means royal. And then we talked about the relationship between royal, real, regal, real estate. But then Bes, B-S, and that's actually how it's spelled in the Egyptian as well. It means, hold on. So royal, oh yeah, royal hawk, basically. So royal hawk, royal kite. When we translate that to Shabazz, so you have the stories about the tribe of Shabazz and all of that in Islam. So there's an etymological link between that Shabazz or the Sabaeans as well as Shabazz when we're talking about the tribe of Shabazz. And then finally we've got royal base, or in other words, peace. I see my dog Divine Master in the building. Peace, peace. So we take that same thing, Shabazz, the Sabaeans, and then we bring that over here to King Zeus. Now, King Zeus, after Tiamat was supposedly destroyed, he basically moved to Mars, and then you end up having a similar situation happen on Mars, where Anu's folks were tripping, and then there was a war. There might have been a civil war. I forget the story, but ultimately Mars ended up becoming what it is today. But this concept of a royal kite over here, and then we got King Zeus. That shows you that we're probably talking about a similar civilization. So even if you don't believe the stories themselves, the symbolism that's found in those stories are showing very clear links between these groups and people that we know existed, as well as these figures that are appearing in these different mythologies. Okay, so in other words, who Anu and them had beef with had something to do with the Sabaeans. All right. And that association with Mars is significant because Mars, especially according to Richard Smith's book, Mars is etymologically linked to the Moors. And in addition to that, they said that they're related to the term Mao associated with the cat. So the Egyptian Mao cat. And so Bess being a cat god himself, you see this continuous theme. And even within that story with Robert Morningsky's version, you see this ongoing theme between a war between cats and dogs, basically, because you have like the Canis people of the Canis constellation, the Syrians, who are pretty much dog-like, and then you have the stories of like Lyrans, Vegans, these different races that they talk about that are like more cat-like, that are our relatives down the line in our soul evolution. And so you just get this ongoing theme that's interesting within these mythologies, and then for it to be well represented and very specific just out of this line of code from this Phi table is just amazing, and it gives you more context in all of it. Like what are we really talking about with this opposition of these forces? We got an initiation talking about here. It has to do with sound and the body. And so that brings me to the last part of this line. So the last part of the line, this 681, gives me Fa. But because we're dealing with the golden ratio, remember the golden ratio and its inverse are basically the same number, except you either got a 1 in the beginning or you got a 0 in the beginning. So in the case of the golden ratio, this line would end with a 1. But if I use the inverse, it would be a 0 in there. So that gives me two words, either fa or fo. Now, in the case of fa, it means to give. So we're thinking gift, give, things of that nature, which you'll see later on has to do with John, because his name means gift of God. But more importantly, it comes from the Bantu word pa, P-A-A. Now, that's interesting. In addition to being from Central Africa, being part of the Bantu, the reason that's fascinating is because, one, that is a word that they use for the, more or less, in the Nuwabian language that Dr. York developed. So they'll have like the Pa Nacharu, they'll have the Pa Nateru, Pa Nagaru and Pa Nateru. But basically they use that Pa, like the way is Pa. I can't remember. It's been a minute. But anyway, but just they use that word Pa. So it's interesting that that shows up there. And I also pointed out in the previous video that the letters themselves, so the numerical value of those 1611, well, 1.611 is an approximation of the golden ratio. So that's fascinating. So give, so something going out, radiating out, which is growth, is Pa in this case. Now, fo, on the other hand, basically means who. Okay. Now, who comes from, I'm going to say Proto-Indo-European language, but the Proto-Indo-European language is essentially developed from the Kwa languages, interestingly enough, which include Afa, Igbo, later on Yoruba, like a bunch of the West African. But like they tell you that they migrate from what we know as the Middle East now, but that was like that area between like Egypt, Sudan. They say that's where the quote unquote Garden of Eden experiments took place, but we'll take that with a grain of salt. But case in point is this who comes from a root word meaning Kwa. So when we talk about the Kwa people, we talking about who? We talking about the people. Which people? They were the only people around at the time, so they were the Kwa people. And so the Kwas are the ones that basically became all the various, basically the base of the languages and the cultures. And so this is why you have some shared traditions among the most well-known West African cultures, but this is just an old ancestor. So we got this idea of the Pa, and we got this idea of the Kwa. So in the golden ratio, we've got the Pa. We associate that with growth and with resistance, whereas we associate this fo, this hu, this qua with voltage pressure. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so something else I forgot to mention about King Zeus is that, according to Robert Morningsky, Enki was a title, basically meaning like Lord or Lord of Earth or something like this. So it's just a title. It wasn't necessarily a name. His name was Zeus. His title was Enki. Well, of course, we know more about Enki that's associated with Ea, who we talked about on line 16, but then we'll get to that later. But apparently there were two Enkis according to Robert Morningsky's version, and Zeus was the original. So you start to see how there may have been some syncretization between the two characters when you see the more popular version of the Mesopotamian myth. And mind you, Mesopotamia was ruled at various times by different groups. So you've had the Sumerians there, you've had the Assyrians there, you've had the Babylonians there, you've had the Akkadians there, and depending on who it was and where they was before they got over there, they took liberties. You know, if it was a god that they liked more than the supreme god that was there before, they'll come and they'll switch that out and write stories about how they knew God, whooped the old guy's ass. Like it was just messy in Mesopotamia. Okay, now another thing that appears in this line is SB. So SB Seb is or better yet Sabah. So we got this idea of Sheba, Shabbat, and then this SB shows up inside of the code. And so in Egyptian, that's Sabah means, it can mean star, meteor, it can mean gate or doorway, and it can mean to teach. So we got this idea of stars being a gateway for teaching. We got these ideas of the golden ratio and language. We got sound being sent through. So this is what's happening in the beginning. So what are these vibrations, these primordial sounds, these primordial waves? What are these root ideas in the structure of the reality that are basically feeding the various events that unfold in our reality? So that's the easiest way to look at it. So let's go on to line 4. We don't want to stay there too much longer. Okay, so we got this line. So if that was 1 square, this is 2 square. And then picture those squares. So picture a square, single square. Now picture 2 by 2 squares making 4 squares as we're expanding out. Okay, so line 4, the first word. So we got the number 96978862740. This is the next combination that pops up. So the first word, that first full word, I usually try to get the longest words that out of it. Like try not to be like too small if possible, but like trying to get like the longest word I can get out of it, and then put those together to see how they work in context of each other. Now in this case, Ifig turns out to be mean ivy. And ivy is a symbol of resurrection that is associated with the Egyptian god Osiris. And so made a note of that. So we got the concepts of Osiris, resurrection. And resurrection comes from a word of to arise or to rise again. You know the story of Osiris with him being resurrected through his son Horus, but we'll get into that in a little bit. We talked significant about Horus recently. So just keep that under your head. Also, Osiris is associated with the planet Venus as well as the star Sirius. So all of those, so Anu and all of them were allegedly from Sirius. There was a trinary star system there. You had some ascended masters from Sirius A. You got some aquatic beings from Sirius B. And then Sirius C is the one that's said to have been destroyed or whatever, and then one of its main planets flew off, and they say that was the planet of the Anunnaki and whatnot. So you got a bunch of Sirius related stuff, but not everybody from Sirius is good or bad. It's just, and it's a big star system. So It just so happens. So we'll leave the jury open on to. So just to give some insight. Osiris was originally known as Asar and Osiris. So Osiris became Lazarus in the Bible and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind. Let's move along. So HH, so that huh, depending on which diacritic you put on it and how you pronounce it, it can either mean heat from the sun, fire breath, the fire breath of like a deity or something like that. Then you have neck and throat, and they made specific that it was a human neck or throat. It can also mean million. We talked about the significance of million with regards to the distances between the planets and the sun given by the supreme wisdom lessons. And so that gives you a hint that this heat from the sun is what they want to draw your attention to. Because particularly in certain practices, the restricting of the throat and the pushing of sound through it generates static electricity that has important applications with regards to your life force and things. And so it is very closely tied to these stories of resurrection and whatnot. Okay, so moving right along. So 627. This is one of those combinations. So we don't really get anything too much of value from FBG unless you want to break that down to the Father Be or Born God, which can give you some context, behind it. But then the more significant application of that 627 is at 627 AD, because we're talking about fire breath from a deity, sounds like a dragon. Well, dragon just happens to be one of the descriptions that the prophet Jeremiah, so 627 AD was the year that Jeremiah is said to have. Oh, that should be BC. That shouldn't be. Why did I put AD? Oh, there, y'all. Let me correct that in case you wanted to get a snapshot. And I'm going to have to take a picture of it myself, too. I'm saving all these slides so I can put them all in one PDF later down the line. But that's supposed to be 627 BC. So anyway, so 627 BC, the prophet Jeremiah in the Bible, among other things, he predicted the siege on Jerusalem in 585. So, 586, 585. And I already did a video based on the significance of that as being the exact center of the 25,000 year period associated with the current Quran, according to the Supreme Wisdom Lessons. All right, and so he was the one that was said to predict it. Now, among other things, he talked about the coming of Nebuchadnezzar, who was supposed to be doing that destruction, and he described him as a dragon. So, dragon type imagery is pretty prevalent in his predictions and throughout that story. Now, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you break his name down, now I don't know if this is actually a thing. This is just me following the theme of the Egyptian, because it keeps on appearing in the numbers, and this is where they were at. So they were exiled down in Egypt at the time, and then Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to come, and he tried to warn the Jewish priests and whatnot, and Nebuchadnezzar came and he ruled that area for a minute. Well, and then I want to say Jeremiah started working with him, like he started making predictions for him and interpreting dreams and stuff. So he switched sides on their behind, but I get, he had his reasons. But anyway, but Nebuchadnezzar, like, in sticking with that Egyptian theme or whatever, his name, it sounds very similar. So the first part, so his name is supposed to mean Nebu, protect my heir. So Nabu is the grandson of Enki, so Ea Enki. The one they say did modifications to the human race and so on and so forth. Well, this would be one the grandson. Okay, and the son of Marduk even. So Marduk is the son of Enki, Ea, who was manipulated into overthrowing Enki's brother, Enlil. And then Nabu is the son of Marduk, who is oftentimes syncretized with Thoth, because he's considered like a god of writing and magic and stuff like that as well. So sometimes those two are kind of smashed together. But Nebuchadnezzar also happens to be the name of a serpent that was tamed by the Egyptian god Atum. So Atum tames this serpent. So there's a significance. I've kind of touched on this in the other videos, but the significance of snake serpent in the old initiation, old mystery traditions, was that it represents word/membrane. And so basically the container of something, the thing that holds things together. So there's certain words, there's certain stories that hold a lie together. I'm not saying that anything here we're talking about is necessarily a lie, but in order to hold the overall story together, there's certain things that have to be consistent. So there's certain words that hold things consistent. That also deals with membranes or D-branes. We talked about that with regards to quantum physics and string theory, where you have these vibrations which are separated by membranes, such that each one of those membranes represents a different dimension. So we were talking about this interdimensional, the way a vibration moves between dimensions. So it may appear one particular way in third dimension, but be something entirely different in one dimension. This is where we're getting into that with Nebuchadnezzar. All right, so in Atum is the primordial creator and father of the other 9 gods of the Ennead. And so he's an important figure that corresponds in a lot of ways to Anu, because Anu is supposed to be one of these primordial type of gods as well, according to certain teachings out there. But anyway, so this last part, so Nedja, so so NTR with or without the diacritic under the T is the word for God, and the Egyptian word for God and nature, they say this is basically where we get the word nature, because it's to say that that's your true essence, your true nature, the people from Earth. But I chose to go with Nedger with the D because his name is Nebuchadnezzar with the Z. That Z is related to the sound DJ. So we've covered that in other videos. And so D with the diacritic, the line under it is the sound J, like that. So Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar. And the reason I chose that is because it basically means carpenter. And so as it turns out, this same motif of Atum taming the serpent Nebuchadnezzar is repeated with Shiva and Shisha in the Hindu, as well as Narayana, which is Vishnu, him and his mount, when he uses Shisha as a mount. So you always have these themes of a man that tames snakes. Other places where you have this, so even with Thoth, he was kind of tied to that. Asclepius, Joseph of the Old Testament, like you had all these people who were associated with the building of the pyramids, who also had this theme of taming snakes or creating medicines, knowing how to get past the venom. You had another figure, Goga, aka Gogaji in India. All the same figure, and apparently all associated with Christ. So we'll get into that another time. But more importantly, all of that ties back to the 13th zodiac sign, Ophiuchus. And so Ophiuchus is the orphan, and this is a description that is given for Atum as well, because he has no father or whatever. He's a self-created being. You have the same description of Allah, but they say a self-created being. And so all of that is embodied in this same particular story. Now, to to wrap up the line, we have Doke. So Doke, D-O-H, coming from that 4-8, actually means a musty smell. What's interesting about that is that the appearance of these particular, remember, it's not just the word, but the combination of the words that appear. And from my understanding of myth, that immediately had me think of the connection between Osiris and Isis, because there's a story about so after, remember in one of the previous videos I was talking a little bit about Isis's lament. And so in that same particular story, which is also related to Lazarus and the three Marys going to France, and they had Saint Sarah with them and all of that stuff that was going on with that, because that gets into the story about so there's three or more figures that we associate with Jesus that were kind of combined into one story, but then basically within that it's all based on this same story. And so the Osiris and Isis lament, Asar and Aset respectively, she's searching for her husband, finally finds him. He's washed up on the shore of Byblos, and his casket has basically been the box that he was in has basically been enshrouded by this tree. And so the royal family of Byblos, they've taken this tree as a post for the castle, for their castle or whatever else. And so Isis, she's outside of the royal castle or whatever else, out in like kind of courtyard by a fountain. She's just sitting there, she's just crying and crying. And so the handmaidens and stuff of the castle, they kind of ignoring her, but then one of the girls notices her smell. So apparently, according to the myths, the gods and goddesses, they had a particular odor, a particular strong smell that was unique to them. And you can get into what it is, because people wasn't washing their ass, and that ain't no jab or insult. It's just the fact of the matter, because the reason you had the Black Plague was because didn't nobody know how to wash their ass. Even then, after that, the royals, like you hear about King Louis, who only like put like a little dab of water on his nose like once a week or stuff, and then they just sprayed perfume over him. So people were stinking. And so maybe this smell that the guys had was just a smell of soap and just cleaning your ass from time to time. I don't know. But anyway, so she notices this and realizes who Isis is, because mind you, Isis, like, she looking rough right now, because she's basically taking on the form of like a crone, like an old raggedy woman, you know what I'm saying, like on some Snow White type stuff, you know what I'm saying, like she the fairest of them all, but she walking around here looking like a hag, but whatever. They realize who she is, and they want her to come in and nurse the royal baby, because it was an honor to have a god come and had let the baby nurse from them or whatever. It was an honor, and it had special effects on the baby. Now, I got into a little bit about what ended up happening with that. She wanted to give the baby immortality, so it required her to put the baby in magical fire, so that we get this idea of the fire breath again. And the pole that Isis turned into a kite or hawk and spun and flew around as she was doing the incantations was the same pillar that her husband was inside of. If you looked at the previous talks, when we talk about the pillars and things of that nature, is a strong possibility that it is related to the obelisks, the stelae in Ethiopia and Heliopolis, that have certain information written on them. In fact, the one in the Axum, from the Axumite Empire, that stela, it has 12 levels to it. So there's a significance to this 12, and it's related to the 12 realms of the construct, according to Darius J. Wright. So all that stuff ties in together. And again, with her turning into that kite, that ties back into that to that Shabes from Line 1 or whatever. So Queen of Sheba. So we got this ongoing theme with this feminine figure, this black woman that it extends here to Set, aka Isis. Now, what does all that even mean together? Now, another interesting tidbit, being that Nebuchadnezzar was from Babylon, it occurred to me one day when I was looking at the word that Babylon was also Babylon. And it turns out that that lawn does in I forget which language, but actually does mean lion. The word lion itself comes from a wild beast, and so we talk about the Temple of Solomon. We talking about the enlightenment of the beast or whatever. You got the so for you as a human being, you have both natures. You have a civilized nature and a beast nature and a wild nature. And so you have to become civilized in order to overcome that beast nature. You have both a mammalian brain that gives you emotions, but you also have a reptilian brain that is basically your survival instinct, your survival functions. And sometimes when we let that survival function, which also includes reproduction urges, when we let that stuff take control of us, then it diminishes our ability to ascend spiritually. And so lion, so it can the word lion actually comes from a word that can mean, like I said, wild beast. Of course, lion as we know it, but also a dog. Like both of those, like anything that's like falls into that like beast of prey type of situation. So you've got a split down the middle that happens there, where we got a split between cat people and dog people, but they have a shared mammalian ancestor. Okay, and so the lion. So me doing the research, I was like, well, what is there a lion that has something to do with, especially a baby lion that has something to do with Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon and so on and so forth. And as it turns out, Nebuchadnezzar II, he was credited with creating this huge gate, this beautifully ornate gate, where it featured, among other things, dragons and lions. The dragons represent Marduk, so that gives you another interesting connection between, Marduk, who is said to have been the same as Ra, who has something to do with the sun, and then also the Marduk would, well, excuse me, Ra would battle with Apep, who was another serpent, who is syncretized with Apophis. The other name was Apophis, who was very likely Epaphus from the Greek myths. And Epaphus is supposed to be the father of the Ethiopians, so the father of black people. So we get this ongoing theme of these descendants of Zeus. King Zeus was associated with Mars, which we've associated with the Moors or the Mao people, the cat people, quote unquote. And then we've got this baby line, Inanna, aka Ishtar, with Osiris's name also being Asar. So Asar, Ashtar, Ishtar. So we got this common thing between those. And Inanna, aka Ishtar, she is definitely associated with Venus. So that same theme of the feminine that's associated with Isis. But interestingly, in the myths from Mesopotamia, in one case, you have her as the granddaughter of Enlil, which makes her the daughter of Nana, the moon god, aka Sin. But you also see her appear as the daughter of Ea, Enki. So who's your kid? Is it Marduk or is it Inanna? And interestingly enough, both of them are depicted on this gate by Nebuchadnezzar. So what this would seem is that these are two aspects of one particular idea or one particular entity. And so the significance of me bringing up the Atum versus the serpent is that that serpent represents your default wild nature, and then you as a conscious being, as the human, are learning how to deal with it. So there is no need to battle, because even when you hear like the stories, like the ET stories and whatever else, when they're talking about reptilians, these reptilians, first of all, there's several different races. These different reptilians. Not all of them are bad. Not all of them are good. But the ones in particular that they are talking about are operating primarily on fourth dimension or higher. So most of these beings, these different aliens or whatever else, they talking about fourth dimension or higher. So it doesn't mean that they necessarily walking around here physically, but they do interact with you in terms of the way events unfold, the way that ideas are transmitted in dreams. There's different ways that these things interact with you. And Isis also happens to be depicted as a serpent, and oftentimes, or at least associated with serpents, like the time that she sent serpents in order to trick Ra into letting her heal him so that she could get his secret name from him. Because apparently, if you got his name from him, you could do certain magic to it. So you got this concept of Ra being at odds with this snake whose name also has something to do with the original, the parents of the Ethiopians. Then you've got Enki, who is depicted as a half. Now, mind you, serpent, like especially when you're talking about sea serpent, is used for both fish and for snakes. So you've got the Zeo fish, so we got a Zeus fish. You got this Enki / Ea, so it's a good chance these are all the same exact person. Fish could easily just be a symbol for initiation in that case, and serpent could be easily be associated with word or membrane, barrier, something that holds things together. All right, so binding. So when you think of a snake, you think of binding, coiling, binding. The golden ratio has a spiral, so we got something coming together here. So we got some pieces here. Let's keep on going, so we can start putting this together. So all of these three. So we got line 9. So these first three lines 1, 4, and 9, we spell A, which is an A, D, and I, respectively. Spelling Adi, which means first in Sanskrit, so Adiyogi. So there's some significance there with the way this spreads out, as he was responsible for the spread of yoga and spiritual teachings for the first time 15,000 years ago, near year 1 of the Asiatic calendar. All right, so in line 9, this is an interesting one, and so I had to do some thinking and working with this one, but because there aren't a lot of good applications for FF, but given the Hebrew, so 6 letter in the Hebrew and Arabic basically correspond to pen or spine, and then the spine in a lot of Eastern modalities has to do with is uses like dragon symbolism. So like dragon related moves in like kung fu and stuff like that usually have to do with twisting the spine. And it can mean unfold, multiply. So an unfolding of events or multiplication of things. Sounds like growth. In Arabic, it means master. So that 6th letter is master. But ultimately, me seeing 2 of those like an unfolding spine, it reminded me of DNA. And so I've seen that combination pop up in a few lines of code, and it does seem to have something to do with DNA or inheritance. Now, alternatively, okay, so EEG, so that 557, egg is a word for egg. I forget which language, but egg does mean egg. And so it looks like we're dealing with something genetics. Now, we already know that there was a genetic experiment and people had kids with each other and stuff up in here. So we got this ongoing element of coming into creation, vibration coming into the womb. We've got resurrection, because remember, Osiris is resurrected through his son Horus, and then Horus is associated with membrane or sky, or this whole concept that we got with serpents and membranes here. Now we got this concept of the egg. And the egg, especially an ovum, when you're talking about the egg in a woman, it comes from, it's basically the source of the word oval. And so I told you how up here that Ebe means oval or temple, and there's a significance to that with regards to Solomon's temple. And do I get into that later on? I'll break it down over here. What Solomon has to do with, so you basically got sunlight, soul. You've got Om. So soul is like Om is the sacred sound, and then On is actually a word for spirit in the East. So you combine those three, Solomon, so the Solomon's temple. So it's this idea of light and sound coming together within spirit, and then that's actually a reference to the event horizon of a black hole, the center of the intersection between wavelength and frequency, which basically the intersection of light and sound. All of that is embedded in that. So the significance of an egg in a lot of these myths, whether it be West African or otherwise, that's basically what it's talking about. This center point is basically at the center of everything, and then that's where the primordial sound is emerging from. It's disturbing the existing medium, and this is where we get the ignition of the first light in the lit there be light, the Big Bang, all of that. Now, something else I was looking at, and I don't too much deal with partial type things, but then with the older languages, like the Alpha language and stuff from West Africa, the Igbo language, you'll often find that a lot of their phrases and terms and stuff are what gave several other phrases from other languages, be it English or Sumerian or whatever else, after that. So there is like a connected interface in between all of these various languages. And so there was this one particular phrase that came out of that. So this Feeg, so Feeg 6557, there was this phrase Figu Neafatsu. And so in addition to having Alpha appear in there, which can mean magic, but it's a divination system, Alpha is also 1.61, so the phi ratio. But Figu Neafatsu means meteor, and we talked about a meteor up here. So what is this connection, this star, this meteor? Well, interestingly enough, in a lot of the stories, the egg, they talk about an egg that came to Earth and people got out of it. So the ancient astronaut theorists, of course, want to look at that as being a spaceship that somebody arrived in. They say Shiva came in that egg. Brahma comes out of an egg in the hint. The creator god comes out of an egg. Isis comes out of an egg in the story, so it's an egg laid by Geb, the god of Earth in the Egyptian pantheon, and he is associated with the goose, which is interestingly also the mount that the Hindu creator god Brahma rides on. So there's a clear connection there. So we got all that, but then this is a connection to a meteor, and so meteors do happen to have all the materials within them frozen in ice necessary to make DNA and other key biochemicals that we need for life to be on this planet. So it's very possible that meteors or things meant to look like meteors crashed here. There's plenty of evidence of that in significant sites where huge meteor strikes happen, and some of that same lore was kind of adopted into the Black Panther um, comic book lore. Like you saw in the first movie where you had the meteor strike, and then it brought vibranium. Was similarly granite. Certain types of granite appeared in that same way from meteors, and the learning how to use granite and its vibrational properties. Like it has piezoelectric properties, which means that if you move it and vibrate it, it can create an electrical current. So this is, and that's basically, it's a certain type of granite that these structures inside the pyramid are based on, as well as the what you call the stelae, aka obelisks in Ethiopia. So there is a common theme there. So it's interesting all that is still popping up. Now there's a couple words that you can get out of this. And so we kind of talked about the significance of that 423 as it related to Horus, Ra, and the tune in a previous video, and how those letters come together to give you Jew, DJW, so Jew, which means a pep. So that same snake we talked about that was at odds with Ra is popping up here. But alternatively, we can get out of that DB, Dub, which deals with either a hippo, tusk, to bend, or horn of the moon, which I have managed to break down in association with. So the Kabyle people of North Africa, so in Algeria, they stay in these mountains that reach from Algeria to like Morocco and Tunisia. And according to the Theosophists, so the Atlantean stage of human evolution, the first Atlanteans were a small group of Lemurians. So you had the Lemurian period between that was mostly like Africans, like primitive versions of hominids in Africa. And then you had the first ones that started to kind of evolve a bit, and they started out in West Africa. And so you had a few other root races, which included like the Toltecs, which were like the parents of like the like Aztecs and all them in South America, da. But case in point, you end up getting to the fourth root race, the Turanians. And the Turanians were basically considered the first ones to become the next root race, which was the Aryans. So after the Atlanteans were the Aryans. So the Kabbals are said to be the direct relatives. They're the most like that original people. If you look at the Kabbals, they are very interesting because they are on the lighter side, kind of how, a lot of folks are in North Africa, but at the same time, their features are still kind of similar to American black people. So it's like, so we have a certain look to us in America because we mix with a bunch of stuff that is slightly different from some of our brethren over on the continent. And it's interestingly rather similar to the Kabbals because they descend directly from us. Now, according to Smith and some of the other lore, apparent if you cross reference what he was saying with what Madame Blavatsky was saying with the Theosophy and all that, and Rudolf Steiner and C.D. Ledbetter, like these different people like this, basically this first root race that became the Aryans, they basically split into two parts. So you had so when these light ones came about, they were kind of acting out, and they wasn't having a good time in that hot sun of the Sahara, and how it is in Africa, and and they acting out, and so they were given the option by the Moors to reform, get their act together, because at the end of the day, they were still part of the human family and stuff. Like, you had other outside influences that were trying to get people to do this or that, but then we still consider them, a welcome part of the human family. And some of them chose to, stick with us and learn from us and so on and so forth. And so those became the Kabbals. Now, the other ones, how that story goes. So they were exiled. Well, not really exiled, but they were placed in Europe for the most part. So the Europe tied them out. So Europa is named for the African queen Europa, who I would very much suggest that same name was at the root of where we get Yoruba, considering where we get that name and where they said they migrated from. And They were put up there because we didn't want to kill them, because they were still family. But at the same time, it's just like that cousin you can't leave around your kids. So, so they so they were sent up to Europe, and Europe has water around it. It's got mountains and ice, and it's surrounded by the Caucasus and all this stuff right here. So we like, y'all chill up here. Like it's better for you sun wise. You ain't got that sun beating on you. You keep burning up. You can be up here. It's cool. Y'all can just stay up here, figure your stuff out. We'll come back to check on you. Well, ultimately what ended up happening is the Dark Ages, especially because you had priests and church and stuff, and just the certain authorities that were popping up that didn't want these people getting educated on their history and their connection to the rest of the human family and whatever else. They ain't want them talking or dealing with no Egyptians. To this day, you still got a problem in the Christian church between them and their idea of Egyptians based on how certain dynasties are presented in the Bible and how certain other dynasties are left out. And so they just have a blanket hatred for Egyptians. But they cut them off. Dark Ages happens. Everybody's sick. Leprosy is just running rampant. All this stuff is happening. And eventually the Moors, they come up there, they clean them up. They teach them how to quarantine, introduce soap to them. I told you that was going to be relevant again. And then, and they brought them out of the Dark Ages. So in certain parts of Europe, to this day, the Moors are very much celebrated. Now, part of the problem with certain other cultures is that they wanted to wipe out the connection of the lighter Moors from the darker Moors and wanted to make separations along those lines. But any real Moor that's worth his salt, he doesn't make that separation because he know who his relatives are. So light or dark, family recognized family in that case. So this is the key distinction. Now, the ones who got sent to Europe, they were upset and had somebody in their ear talking about, you see how they did you? They done put you up here by yourself and da. And you deserve to have what they have. Now, wasn't none for free. We had a university system. We had a mystery school. You had to go through initiations and stuff to show that you were responsible with the knowledge, that you could use it for the betterment of all mankind. Well, they wanted to bypass the system. And so those who are the fathers of what we would refer to as white Freemasonry, they wanted to let folks graduate with less degrees than what they're supposed to have. You started having nepotism, that people hiring their kids and stuff just because it's their kids, stuff we still see today. And so this created all sorts of problems because you had people who thought they had power, thought they had authority, people using their Harry Potter wand all wild and hurting stuff and creating abominations and stuff. It was just a clusterfuck. Now, the other word, so moving on from that, the other word that comes out of that is woke. So this is alternatively woke, which is also ironic given the context of the day. Oh, before I go on to that, so the other reason of me bringing that up, the Kabbals in the first place, was because with that horn of the moon, what I was able to distinguish is that it's a reference to keratin. So apparently, depending on the shape of your hair follicle, if it's perfect circle, you will have straight hair. If it's an oval, remember oval, shrine, egg. If it's an oval shape, you'll have curly hair, and the more elongated that oval, the more tightly curled your hair will be, like African hair. Now, I ain't think I was gonna get into this as like this soon, but the word follicle actually comes from a word from follis, which is a Latin word meaning purse or bag. So when you see them holding these purses and bags, now this is one of those mysteries that they've been trying to debate on, and historians been trying to debate on for ever, and I figured it out. But so in Samaria, as well as the Mayans, as well as like all these different cultures around the world have these deities holding these bags. What the bag represents is the shape of the follicle. So if your follicle is a golden oval, which basically means the ratio of one axis to its other axis is the golden ratio, you will have hair similar to that of certain Latin and Native American folks, certain Mediterraneans. You got some curly haired folks up there. But most importantly, if you are a black person, particularly those who are born in Georgia and Florida, you had a higher likelihood of not only being mixed with Europeans, but you were also mixed with Native Americans, the Seminoles and folks like that were here. Now, they use excuses to say that, to keep you from being able to have tribal citizenship and being recognized for it. But it's statistically known that because of the way that the Spanish handled their slave trade, if you descend from folks who were born in Georgia and Florida or imported from West Africa during that time, you have a specific mixture that is called Pardo. Pardo means that you are 1/3 African, 1/3 Native American, and 1/3 European. Because the natives who were already here, like Tainos, whoever else, like you don't see no straight haired Bahamians, and they are very Taino. Any straight hair that you see in Puerto Rico, because they get afros too. If you see some straight hair, it's mostly from the European part. Now, the natives who were already here they were dark skinned, had tightly knitted hair. Those lighter Indians and straight hair Indians that you start seeing later on, that was because of European influence, hands down. Now, that would mean that you would have 2/3 of your heritage, so the black and the natives, so African and native, 2/3 of your heritage would be that tightly curled hair, but you got that 1/3 of the European. 2-to-1 happens to be considered one of the approximations of the golden ratio in the Fibonacci sequence. So 1 and 2 are consecutive numbers in the Fibonacci sequence. That 2-to-1 ratio that you have is very, very common among African Americans. Like, our hair curls, just, it's coiled nicely, but it don't curl up as tight as them Africans from the motherland or some folks from the Caribbean. And you know this, if you ever had to try to comb your baby hair, or if you used to get braids and stuff, the texture of our hair is just slightly more manageable when it comes to that stuff. So the reason those guys hold those purses in all of them inscriptions and art and whatever else is because that is what tells you that you have the DNA of who we were calling the gods. As the story goes, Enki was the one that helped develop the hominids. So you had some already evolving hominids on the planet. So this would be like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, all of these. And this is acknowledged in Igbo history too. So this ain't just something that white folks were making up. This is acknowledged in our history too. So he initially bred these people. Peace. I see my dog Lurch. He initially bred them so that they could be workers and so on and so forth. His brother Enlil, he wasn't getting along with him. He wasn't just finna be no, you wasn't finna let him boss him around, and he should have been the one running Earth in the first place. So he decides to secretly educate some of his, they were called Adapers, and so he started educating some of them. They started being called Adamu, so Adam, Atum. And so among these, he had certain initiates that he called the Iesu. So this is where we end up with the term Jesus later down the line. It wasn't just one person, but it was the name for a certain type of initiate, and they had a certain type of cave that they were going to, and they had certain technologies to educate these folks. The same technology could be used to brainwash people, but then he was using it to educate them secretly behind his brother's back. All right, so things eventually go south as Enlil learns what Enki and his consort sister Nehersag were up to. It was actually her idea to upgrade them in the first place with the what they call the gene of gene of passion. So this becomes the passion of the Christ, which eventually becomes the story of the passion of the Christ later on. But it was this gene from this high dimensional avian race which called the Ankiel. So we remember we broke down the Ankiel, and that's especially in line 16. But so certain gene was transferred for them into these Adamos. And then mind you, this is happening in Africa, so in this area near the Mediterranean, north of Egypt, like this particular area where they're saying the Eden experiments are happening. This is where that gene was introduced. This is where our curly hair comes from. Because if you look online, like if you search on Google, there's an article or two about the gene that the gene that allows birds to have feathers instead of scales. So keep in mind that whole imagery of the winged serpent that they talk about with Thoth and blah blah blah. The same gene that allows birds to have feathers instead of scales is the gene that allows us to have tight curly hair instead of straight hair. So interestingly enough, they talk about the introduction of this gene from the Ankels, where we get the word angel, and so on and so forth. Then you get the stories where the Nuwabians talk about how Mary was actually impregnated by the angel Gabriel, and all of this, which somehow matches up with what the Mormons were talking about Gabriel appearing as the angel Moroni and giving Joseph Smith these tablets. So a lot of these folks have the same information. They just twist it a little bit to their own needs, and oftentimes in a racist way. But for the most part, everybody's sourcing the same underlying teachings. But anyways, so this gene of passion was introduced. It basically made it so that they would be able to resist the mind control of Enlil and his folks, and part of that involved basically the sex drive. So they could basically, by getting them to have sex with, instead of just they were paired off with, they had to mate with a specific person, they can only do it certain times. Well, he just disrupted all that, let them mix and blend and have sex whenever they wanted to. Enlil was mad because he couldn't sell these slaves because they were all mixed up now, and sent the dogs after his brother. And as a final middle finger to his brother, he gave some of his own blood to the last batch of those Iesus, and as a result, they then had the royal bloodline. So the real estate of Earth and these people who were trying to take over the solar system and state claim to that, it was all based on the fact that they had a certain bloodline, and then by him introducing that into the humans, now we had the rightful claim over Earth. So the only reason that we if there are all these extraterrestrials out there and whatever else, and they so big and bad, the reason that they can't just come and take Earth is because we got the royal stake to it, like we on throne. But also, as initiates, we understand that there is no such thing as real estate, because everything is actually a waveform that we basically make agreements in reality to say, oh, I'm going to be able to interact with this as if it's physical and solid, and I'm not going to be able to interact with that. And so we're able to shape our own experience in this construct, like on a soul level. All right, and so that's just kind of the pieces that I play. Now I was talking about that woke word. It also means langur. So langur just happens to be the type of monkey that Hanuman is in the Hindu lore, and is basically the identical story, same story of Jesus, like beforehand, except it's basically Shiva and his wife Shakti. They have a seed. They have the god of breath. So they Vayu. So we got breath, Vayu, Hewas, Yahweh Hewas. Basically, Vayu transfers their seed into a Vanara mother. Vanara means forest dweller, and it's a reference to the rainforest dwellers, the pygmies and whatnot that inhabited the Congo of Central Africa. These were Bantu speakers. So this is the significance again of this Paa, this Bantu word, Proto-Bantu word, as a matter of fact. And so that whole Hanuman story and his assistant Rama, the god of Rama, is related to the story of Eri, the deity who was said to have come to the Igbo, who essentially is Thoth for the most part, and taught. So this is why you have this overlap between the Ecom monoliths in West Africa and these tradition of different Egyptian as well as Atlantean teachings in these various traditions. Like it's all connected. Everybody got the same story. And so that's appearing here as well. But that word also, in addition to languor, same language, it also means to originate or to be born, arise, resurrection associated with Jesus. Like I said, the Hanuman story, he's this god of humbleness and bhakti, which is devotional yoga and stuff like this. That's also associated with Jesus, especially in the esoteric traditions where he's known as Master, Guru Master Isa, or Guru Master Jesus, who went to India and studied and basically was initiated into what's called the sixth ray initiation, which is associated with devotion as well as altruistic love, and what the Greeks call agape love. So love for your fellow man, not romantic love, but love for humanity, and so on and so forth. So all that is consistent. And the last part, that DH, Dek, which is Egyptian for to become hidden. And so that become hidden is associated with the god Amun. So you had two Amuns. You had the original Amun, which was the name of a particular set of hidden initiates who was supposed to protect the secrets. And so this kind of falls in line with like the Muslim sons that you hear about in the Supreme Wisdom lessons, who were the ones, the lighter ones, who were taught to keep the secrets safe and things. But then you had another Amen who came later, who we associate, so that Amen Ra. So we associate that largely with Marduk. And he was in league with the Shetu. So these were a certain type of gray. It's not reflective of all grays because you got Zetas and all of them too. But it was a particular type of gray that was basically the source of Freemasonry and all of that stuff. You hear the story of Hiram Abiff, who was murdered by some of these. He was one like the master builder, one of the first master builders who was murdered by these three grays according to the stories and whatnot. But anyways, so oak by itself. So if we're gonna go the Jew route, so this route with the snake and the pip and whatever else, Epaphus, oak is the rune in Nordic language. And mind you, the Nordics were like Finland and all of them. They are descendants of West Africans. So we migrated up there. The first Atlanteans from that particular root race migrated up there. Eventually got lighter, so on and so forth. But anyways, but oak is a female god and related to the word Ansuz, the rune Ansuz, meaning god. And so we basically got this Ethiopian snake god, quote unquote. Well, one of the main initiates, one of the main ascended masters that they mention in Theosophy is one named Serapis Bey. And then that Bey automatically tells you he's a Moor. And Serapis is a word related to serpent, the snake. So this is who we may be referring to when we talk about the original serpent. This person who was basically an ascended master who was demonized in stories and history by Enlil and his folks, and that extend from his legacy, as well as these other Shetu who came in. And so, interestingly enough, the same DH word also means revenge and overthrow. So become hidden. We got this snake guy. We got this folks. So that whole concept of Hirama Biff being overtaken by these vengeful little midgets. That ain't nice. But these vengeful Shetu. And it's basically this ongoing revenge plot for them Inky giving us access to the royal blood, so they can't just claim this land. We still have stake in here. Now we've been going pretty long. It's after 6 o'clock now, and then it's gonna take a little while to do this other half. But we already talked about line 16. But in the next, I'll do a part 3 to this one. But I'll go through these last few lines and what this other stuff is here. But basically what we're building up, this is basically where all the stories throughout our human history come from these lines. Like, so you see how there's several different stories that apply to each one of these lines, but then it starts to put it into context so you can figure out where the pieces fit, which things were kind of embellished on, which twists and turns it went through. But all of this was on the first tablet of the 3. The first line 16 was on a tablet by itself, and then lines 25 and 36 were the first and last lines of the 3rd tablet. So that's basically where some stabilization is starting to happen. And so we'll put it all together, get into them last couple of details, and then once we're done with this, I will start the end game of kind of wrapping up some of the final codes that you need and that you can use. The 13th code, so the 7th, it will be a 7th line, an important line, and certain things that shouldn't exist, but they exist, and it does seem that we have some help. There's some significance to why I brought up the Black Panther here. There's a reason why I brought up that name, the Pardo people, like that mixture that we are, because that pard, think of the same pard that's in leopard. Like we already talked about the connection to the lion, so leopard, so lion pardo or whatever. So that's going to be significant later on in figuring out what our identity is, what lineages we are connected to, what our purpose is, what our true history is, which ascended masters and various races we are connected to, and how we activate some of the inheritance that we have. I'll just put it that way. How we activate that. Anyways, on that note, like I said, we'll do a part 3. I'll probably do that tomorrow sometime, but I'm going to wrap this one up here. I think that's enough for y'all to wrap your head on. If you haven't, screenshot it. If you haven't watched the other ones, make sure you watch those to get caught up so you understand what we're talking about here. And on that note, peace, y'all.